So I would like to begin with a few quotes that show diametrically opposed views of sleep. Now, these both come from very successful business people, and I'm not really interested in their other political differences, but they just reflect different ways we can think about sleep. So from Donald Trump, he says, "Don't sleep any more than you have to. I usually sleep about 4 hours per night." On the other side, we have Arianna Huffington, who says, "The way to a more productive, more inspired, more joyful life is getting enough sleep." So at this time, I'd like to bring up the house lights for a moment, and let's just take a quick poll in this room. How many of you got 8 or more hours of sleep last night? Raise your hands. So I see a lot of people not raising their hands right now, and this might be because you think of yourselves as invulnerable to small amounts of sleep deprivation. Like you have a superpower that protects you from missing a few hours here or there. That if I get just 5 or 6 good hours of sleep, I'll be totally fine. This is a common story we tell ourselves. Well, one of my favorite studies ever was conducted in Germany. And what they did is they brought in research participants, and on one day, they had them consume alcohol and monitored as their performance declined as that alcohol consumption went up. Then they let them sober up, gave them a full day of rest, and brought them back into the laboratory. And what they did this time was partially sleep deprive them. For 4 nights in a row, they had these people sleep 5 hours per night. And again, watch their performance decline over this time. And then what they did is compare the performance decline from those 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep to the performance decline from alcohol consumption. And where these lines crossed was at a blood alcohol content of 0.06. Now, some of you are doing some quick math right now. Wait, what's the legal limit in Oregon to drive? It's 0.08. Some of you knew that really fast. So what I'm really saying here is that if you have 4 nights in a row of 5 hours of sleep, the performance decrement that you're suffering is almost the same as somebody who's legally too drunk to drive. So even missing a few hours of sleep absolutely has noticeable impacts on outcomes that we should care about. So hence the picture of the person who's drinking and is impaired without really being aware of being impaired. And I think that's a scary combination. So there's a neat convergence of research right now, some that's happening in sleep medicine, and there are a few management researchers like myself who are looking at what happens when people are sleep deprived and go to work. So we know from a large body of literature that there's one part of your brain that is especially involved in functions like creativity and self-control and managing your attention. Unfortunately, we also know that this part of the brain is especially vulnerable to the effects of sleep deprivation. So when you're sleep deprived and you're trying to get a really important task done, you are going to be less creative and less innovative, which is a really big problem in industries where innovation is the lifeblood and how these organizations survive. Some of my own research looks at how do people suffer decrements in self-control when sleep deprived. And what I found is that when you're sleepy, your ability to resist temptations declines, and as a result, you're especially likely to behave unethically. I find this in a laboratory setting with students who are lying to get more raffle tickets. I found this in work settings where people were taking credit for other people's work or blaming others for their own mistakes. So the same person can become more unethical just because they did not sleep very well. You might also notice that when you're sleep deprived, you have a hard time focusing your attention. Some of you right now are wandering with your minds and not paying attention to me because you didn't sleep very well last night. There's another part of your brain that is especially important for functions like managing your emotions. This part of the brain is also especially vulnerable to sleep deprivation. So we see that when people are sleep deprived, they become especially irritable and grumpy and easily frustrated and maybe depressed and wildly swing amongst different emotional states. You see this if you have small children. Right about their bedtime, you say, "Oh, little Johnny's getting cranky. I know what's going on. He's tired." Same thing applies to us as working adults. We go to work sleep deprived, grumpy, irritable, and we interact with our colleagues in a way that poisons the work environment. So I have some research that indicates that people like their job less when they are sleep deprived. We also see that sleep deprived employees are less cooperative and more selfish, and thus not as effective when you put them together in teams. So when we look at this overall from sort of a bottom line perspective, for outcomes that managers might care about, we see that relatively small amounts of sleep deprivation leave employees low in work engagement. They're more likely to cyberloaf at work. Their task performance suffers. They're actually more likely to be injured in the workplace. All things that you should absolutely care about from a business perspective from your employees being sleep deprived. This becomes even more interesting when we look at this from a perspective of leadership. So leaders are really important in organizations because they're especially influential, and we really rely on them to make sure that the job gets done. So I looked at two different forms of leadership. One is abusive supervision. And abusive supervision is what it sounds like. It's when your boss is being a jerk. So we see that the same boss can be nice on some days and jerky on other days. And one reason that this happens is because after a poor night of sleep, the boss comes to work low in self-control and is especially likely to lash out at employees. And we found that when this happens, those employees are especially likely to be low in work engagement. We tested this in a field setting with 90 managers and about 200 of their subordinates, followed them on a 2-week period, tracking them over this time. In a separate study, I looked at what we call charismatic leadership. So all of us want a boss who is charismatic. These charismatic leaders get people inspired about their work and excited about the mission and the vision they're trying to accomplish with this organization. So we find that when leaders are sleep deprived, they are less charismatic, in part because they're less able to manage their emotions. We also flip over this leadership coin and look at the followers, the subordinates. And when your subordinates are sleep deprived, it's harder to inspire them. They come to work grumpy, and you try to give them this motivational speech, and it just falls flat, falls on deaf ears. So these positive and negative forms of leadership are clearly influenced by sleep. So it's not just that your sleep influences your own outcomes, but a leader's sleep can influence the outcomes of subordinates as well. So given that we know that sleep has such important effects in the workplace, some of the questions we should be asking ourselves are, why is this happening, and what can we do about it? So I'm just going to focus on a few small points here in hopes that we can start a conversation that will lead to some steps in the right direction towards being a society that has better sleep health and better work outcomes as a result. So one thing that we often get wrong is the schedules by which we work and live and sleep. So we all have a sleep governing process that we call the Circadian Process that determines when we sleep and when we wake. So you find that there are certain times of the day where it's easy to fall asleep and hard to be awake, and other times of the day where we have the opposite. Unfortunately, a lot of the times we misalign our work schedules with our natural circadian process, and as a result, we're fighting against our own sleep systems. We see this early in life when we're in high school. High school students have a shift in their circadian system such that they naturally tend to fall asleep late and wake up late. Now, we call them lazy for doing this, but this is really just a physiological process that is very natural. So what do we do with these high school students? We give them the earliest school start times. My high school started at 7:30 in the morning, and of course I had to take the bus and get ready, so I was getting up at 6 in the morning, which is really in conflict with what a natural sleep pattern would have been for someone of that age. There's research on this, and we see that when schools have early start times, students struggle to stay awake. They have a hard time doing well in their classes. They're more likely to act out behaviorally, and they're also more likely to get into auto accidents on the way to school. This research also indicates that if we can just shift these school start times back by a few hours, all of these outcomes improve. Same thing applies to us as working adults. A lot of us work schedules that go well into the night, or perhaps rotating schedules that can really wreak havoc on your sleep systems. And we suffer the same effects as the high school students. Now, there are some industries that pay a lot of attention to this and have spent a lot of time developing some guidelines on how can we establish schedules that minimize the disruptions to our sleep. And there are good reasons for this. Medicine and transportation are industries where we have clear outcomes that we can see when something goes wrong. Nobody wants to have the surgeon operate on them when that surgeon has been up for 30 hours straight. Nobody wants to fly on an airplane when that pilot has been up for 30 hours straight. So because of this, they have guidelines in place that help eliminate these possibilities or greatly reduce the frequency. I say that pilots and surgeons are not the only people in this world doing important work. Many of the rest of us have important outcomes at work that can be harmed by sleep deprivation. And so if we applied some of these guidelines more broadly, we could benefit as a society. Another issue is other behavioral patterns that we engage in that are inconsistent with a healthy sleep lifestyle. So one example of this is these guys. These are fantastic devices. They enable us to do all sorts of really cool things. But we often use them in ways that undermine our own sleep. Some of my own research indicates that when you use your smartphone late at night, it means you fall asleep later, you get less sleep, the next day you go to work tired, and you're lower in work engagement. So by trying to cram in some more work on your phone late at night, you actually work less the next day. So this is one example of a behavior that we engage in that's inconsistent with healthy sleep. There are many others, such as consuming caffeine or nicotine close to bedtime, or alcohol, exercising with a few hours of bedtime. Doing things in your bed, like using your smartphone or watching movies. Some of us turn our beds into an office and a home theater and, who knows, maybe a kitchen. Really, what we should be doing is maximizing the link between bed and sleep. There's only two things that should ever happen in your bed. You're exactly right, sleep and sex. And for those who are married, only one of those is going to happen anyway. So what we can do here is look at these behavioral patterns that undermine sleep and those that are healthy for sleep, and put this education out to help inform people so they can make healthier choices. And the NIH does have an educational module that is focused on high school students, which is great. I think that's fantastic. But it's relatively narrowly focused, and we shouldn't be relying only on one agency to provide this information to the general public. So this is something I think we can do more broadly. The last point that's going to be my focus today returns us to the topic of leadership. And here's where I'll focus on these quotes. So I mentioned the Donald Trump quote as sort of encapsulating one end of the spectrum. And there are other CEOs who make similar statements. I don't want to pick only on him. There are other CEOs like Richard Branson and Martha Stewart and Jeffrey Immelt who have made similar statements about being too busy to sleep and sleeping maybe 4 to 5 hours a night as a regular thing. So I have some new research that indicates that when leaders engage in this kind of role modeling, they set norms that make it clear how everyone else is supposed to act as well. So when leaders make these kinds of statements, and when they send emails at 2 in the morning, and generally make it clear that I don't sleep, and neither should you, this is how it plays out. Their subordinates actually sleep less as a result. Or you can be on the other end of the scale, much like the Arianna Huffington quote. And there are other CEOs who are also successful who have made similar statements about how sleep is a great way to restore yourself so you can be especially effective at work the next day. CEOs like Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Eric Schmidt from Google. These are people who say, yes, we can sleep well so that we can work well. So many of you are currently leaders in your organizations, and of the rest of you, a lot of you will become leaders at some point. So you can be a part of this and be a positive role model and make it clear that I want you to sleep well so that you can give me your best at work the next day. So I encourage all of us to become a part of the solution and lead by example. Thank you.